and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korea is intensifying its missile testing activities to demonstrate nuclear strike capabilities against South Korea. In the face of the North Korean nuclear threats, there are calls in South Korea to go nuclear, either redeploy U.S. tactical nuclear weapons or develop South Korea's own weapons. Today, we'll discuss the deterrence strategy on the Korean Peninsula.
하나하나 저희도 다 검토하고 있습니다. 남북 9.19 협의 위반인 건 맞습니다.
That there will be additional costs imposed on the DPRK if it goes forward with the seventh nuclear test.
Joining us for insight and analysis, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's new edited volume reviews the first decade of North Korean foreign policy under Kim Jong-un. Also joining us, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin spent more than 3 decades in the U.S. government and think tanks. He previously served as Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Welcome to Washington Talk.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Snyder, North Korea carried out a series of provocations on the 14th. It carried out a short-range ballistic missile testings and then also flew military aircraft near border with South Korea and also shot artilleries, 170 of them, to the maritime buffer zone, which is a clear violation of inter-Korean military agreement. Now, is this good enough reason for South Korea to walk away from its comprehensive military agreement with North Korea?
Well, you know, I think we all knew that at some point North Korea was going to test the Yoon Suk-yeol administration with escalation. I think we're seeing that. But actually, what I think is notable about this multi-pronged effort by North Korea is that it also was relatively low risk for North Korea. All of the things that North Korea did are things that they either have done or things that don't quite breach the line in terms of driving a South Korean response. And so with regards to the comprehensive military agreement, my view is that, well, we've seen that Yoon has declared that it is a violation of the comprehensive military agreement, and the Yoon administration has said that it really is up to North Korea's attitude. And I would suggest that the Yoon administration should not feel bound by the agreement, but I'm not so sure it's a good thing to walk away from it. And one very interesting development, I think, will be to see whether or not or how South Korea decides to respond as part of its own military exercises that are going to be occurring next week. And I think the key to that is to look carefully at the contents of the comprehensive military agreement and to make sure that the Yoon administration itself knows what it wants to keep and what it might be willing to set aside.
What will be U.S. reaction, Mr. Snyder, if South Korea decides to walk away? It would raise tensions on the Korean Peninsula.
Well, I think it'll be a complicated reaction because I don't think that the U.S. government was necessarily incredibly invested or excited about the comprehensive military agreement back in 2018, but they have come to become used to it. It's the new status quo. And so anything that possibly increases tension is going to be a matter of concern. But you know, on this issue in particular, it's an inter-Korean agreement. And I think that following consultations that the U.S. will support what the Yoon administration decides to do.
Now, Dr. Cronin, Kim Jong-un oversaw tactical nuclear exercises involving missile testings. And North Korea said they simulated attacks on South Korea's command and control centers, airports, and ports. So how does this relate to North Korea's Korean War contingency, war strategy? Is North Korea trying to stop U.S. troops from entering South Korea in such contingency?
Well, first, it's a simulated exercise, so we don't know exactly what North Korea has by way of tactical nuclear weapons. But yes, presumably this is a way to both stop U.S. reinforcements, but more generally to stop U.S. and South Korean offensive against North Korea in response to whatever contingency is underway. So yeah, they're going to go after the main bases where you have aircraft and ships that could project power toward North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Snyder, Japanese defense minister said that North Korea has miniaturized warheads that can be mounted on short-range ballistic missiles that can reach Japan, whereas military experts, they say North Korea cannot volume fire because of the long lag time between the two missile testings, and they also question about shooting missile from a reservoir. So, even if North Korea's missile testing, even if North Korea's missiles are not perfect, should we still think that it is perfect and be prepared, U.S. and South Korea?
Well, absolutely, it's necessary to be prepared. And I think that the important dimension of that discussion is related to U.S.-South Korea combined war planning, which now really must grapple with the issue of possible tactical nuclear use, given that North Korea has developed a capability and has expressed an intention to potentially use nuclear weapons in the battlefield. But at the same time, I think that there are a lot of options that the U.S. And South Korea would have in order to respond to North Korea's enhanced capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cronin, North Korea's short-range ballistic missiles can reach South Korea in minutes, and they fly trajectories that are irregular, and also coupled with the cruise missiles. Is South Korea's three pillars of missile defense, kill chain, defend, and retaliate, is this nullified because there's concerns in South Korea that they actually are nullified?
Well, again, let's not jump ahead to North Korea's capabilities. They're testing capabilities right now that may be deployed and may actually be able to do those things in the future. They're certainly trying to nullify South Korea's ability to strike North Korea. They're trying to have a stalemate in terms of nuclear deterrence, and I think they're achieving that, and they have achieved it for years in some ways. The United States and South Korea have no intention to launch offensive strikes against North Korea. So North Korea is just adding to the deterrent level to some extent, but they can't actually use those systems without threatening their own existence.
Mm-hmm. Now I want to turn to another discussion topic, that is growing calls in South Korea to acquire nuclear weapons to counter North Korea's growing nuclear threat. Now, Dr. Cronin, given the sophistication of North Korea's nuclear and missile technologies, is it worth even considering redeploying U.S. tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea?
Well, it's worth talking about it, but I don't think we should make that decision to go ahead with it. One, there are practical problems. We don't really have any good tactical nuclear systems to deploy back to South Korea. We no longer have, for instance, the nuclear Tomahawk cruise missile that we had. We don't have the old nuclear weapons that we removed in 1991-92. So secondly, there's really very little military advantage because the U.S.-South Korean alliance is a nuclear alliance. Together and unified, we project and deter the power to stop North Korea from launching any attack without risking the livelihood of Kim Jong-un and the regime. So we have to talk about this new nuclear alliance in the context of North Korea's improvements, just as in the NATO context, they have to talk about tactical nuclear weapon possible use by Russia and Ukraine, just as Japan now needs to talk about our extended deterrence with that ally as well. So there is a new nuclear dimension to our alliances, but it doesn't necessarily mean South Korea has to have nuclear weapons or that we have to have them located in South Korea, which would be a short distance also from North Korean weapons. We want them safer, actually, because it won't take very long for our nuclear weapons to arrive or other systems to arrive in North Korea if we ever have to cross that Rubicon.
But if, Mr. Snyder, the U.S. nuclear weapon is redeployed to South Korea, wouldn't that strengthen deterrence against North Korea and somehow put South Korea in a level position as North Korea in denuclearization negotiations?
Maybe that could be the case, but it's kind of untested. And I think that the challenge here is related to the question of whether parity really gets you any particular advantage. We only have one other case study to look at, and that is South Asia, where at least, knock on wood, parity has probably, it's been a fact of life, and we haven't seen a conflict. But it's hard to say that that parity has reduced the risk of conflict. And really, I think the challenge is related more to the psychology of the issue and the question of deterrence versus assurance. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the realm that we're in right now is that we have an ally who needs assurance, and we have a fundamental gap actually in view between a U.S. approach that is comfortable with global extended deterrence and a South Korean view that is very focused on the regional balance issues as related to nuclear weapons capability present on the peninsula.
Dr. Cronin, Mr. Snyder just mentioned about South Korean view, and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol said he's listening to opinions both from Seoul and Washington. And from the ruling party, there's really vocal voices about acquiring nuclear weapons. So if South Korea strongly pursues and strongly asks the U.S. to redeploy tactical nuclear weapons, do you think the U.S. government will make that decision to deploy some?
So the short answer is no. I don't think they would actually deploy anything nuclear right now to South Korea. But if asked by South Korea, we would probably do everything else to strengthen the extended deterrence capability short of that. And there are a lot of things we can do, including our nuclear assets in the region that could be deployed or could deploy rotationally or in exercises to demonstrate our capacity and the strength of the alliance to respond to aggression.
Both of you are mentioning how there's a gap between Seoul's perception and Washington's perception on this issue. If any of you can take my question, 70% of South Koreans want to develop their own nuclear weapons. There's also same discussions in Japan. Do you think South Korea and Japan, both U.S. allies in Asia, there's growing unease over U.S. provided extended deterrence? And is it only natural for them to come up with this discussion at this point?
Good.
The credibility of extended deterrence is clearly open to question, and I think is increasingly being questioned. And I think that is one reason why the extended deterrence security consultation group is really important in the U.S.-South Korean context, and why it's necessary to have those kinds of discussions in the U.S.-Japan context as well. South Korean public opinion, I think, definitely reflects a discomfort with the situation as it has developed with North Korea and a frustration with that. But we also see high degrees of support for the alliance, right? And so I think that the key to this process is to find an alliance solution to the extended deterrence credibility challenge that we face.
So Mr. Snyder previously talked about how U.S. views this as from a global perspective, and South Korea view it from regional perspective. Dr. Cronin, so how does U.S. government, what is its thinking on this issue in its global strategy about this, whether to deploy tactical weapon on South Korea or not?
Well, I understand the passion to protect your national sovereignty, and the United States is committed to helping South Korea do that, and that's what the alliance is all about. But President Yoon has gone to the United Nations and talked about the principles of nuclear nonproliferation. He understands the global role that South Korea is playing on this issue. It's more than the Korean Peninsula. So we need to pursue multiple interests here. The safety of South Korea, deterrence, stability, but also international nonproliferation norms as well. So how do we do both of those things together? And that's where the extended deterrence discussions come in and are so important to deciding. And there are things we can do, just as the United States has supported South Korea extending their missile ranges, extending cooperation and information sharing with Japan, thinking about greater integration of our systems, upgrading South Korean defenses. There are a lot of things we are doing that strengthen deterrence.
Now, Mr. Snyder, U.S. has a lot of nuclear weapons that can come to use in South Korean contingency, ICBMs, and then Trident submarines in the Pacific. Although there are ideas in South Korea that if they have a weapon on their soil, it could operate capabilities more instantly.
Well, and Patrick has already addressed some of this in terms of how the U.S. is viewing that question. But I think that the major task of the Extended Deterrence Consultative Group is really to deal with two issues. One is the issue of the importance of assurance to South Korea of the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence and operationally how that would be carried out. But the second dimension of the discussion that should be there is the question of in what way does this develop in terms of the specific needs of the peninsula? And what does extended deterrence look like in that context? And so, it means that the South Korean side, needs to put forward a strategic rationale for a redeployment of nuclear weapons that goes beyond, well, they've got some, so we need some.
They've got some, we need some. NATO-like nuclear sharing, Dr. Cronin. In Europe, U.S. has deployed some tactical nuclear weapons there, and also NATO is sharing nuclear with the United States. Circumstances are different because NATO, they have nuclear, other countries like UK and France. But there's a lot of talk in South Korea about this NATO-like nuclear sharing. How can this be put to practice in South Korean situation?
Well, the nuclear sharing negotiations that happened over decades during the Cold War led to a system of trust on how to secure forward-based nuclear weapons that might be used if all parties agree that they should be used, and they could veto this. That kind of discussion right now that we're having between South Korea and the United States could ultimately lead to some kind of arrangement in the future. Who knows? But we're not there now. We don't need to jump to that kind of decision. We should be much more strategic about how we go about this because, one, North Korea has not fully developed these systems. Two, we do have strong deterrence. North Korea cannot actually use the systems they're testing. Despite the flurry of tests, Kim Jong-un cannot use a single weapon without putting his regime in harm's way. Let's talk about that. The D5 missiles that we have on our ballistic missile submarines, the United States has spent trillions of dollars on our nuclear weapons over years, over decades. We have these submarines underwater. He doesn't know where they are, and they have low-yield nuclear warheads on some of these weapons, and they could be used against North Korea if we had to defend South Korea and U.S. interests against aggression from North Korea. I'm not saying we would go there, but we have that capability. He knows it. He's deterred.
Dr. Cronin said Kim Jong-un cannot use nuclear weapons, but Mr. Snyder, isn't that the message that North Korea is making all efforts right now to send out to South Korea and the U.S. that he can actually use tactical nuclear weapons against South Korea?
Sure, that's absolutely the message that he's trying to send, and I think we have to think about why he's trying to send that message. And that is because he remains vulnerable. And I think what's really interesting is that despite all the efforts and decades of investment in efforts to develop nuclear weapons as a treasured sword for North Korea, it's still not reducing Kim Jong-un's feeling of vulnerability. And so that's actually the fundamental argument why these weapons are just not fit for North Korea, is that there's no way to get rid of the vulnerability and there's no such thing as absolute security, even if you're a dictator.
I want to go a step further and talk about the possibility of South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons. Would there be unintended benefits to developing its own nuclear weapons? For instance, China could be more proactive in persuading North Korea to denuclearize?
Well, if you look at China's blistering criticism of Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States over nuclear propulsion technology, not nuclear weapons, but just nuclear propulsion for a conventional submarine, you get the idea that China would really stop and put their foot down. Remember what they did to THAAD, one THAAD battery, which is just a missile defense system, a limited missile defense system. So China would be outraged.
What would be the negative consequences, Mr. Snyder, especially on the US-RK alliance?
Well, I would actually argue that the situation is different now from the way it has been for decades, during which the alliance and nuclear acquisition were basically diametrically opposed issues. nuclear acquisition for South Korea would break the alliance. I don't think that we're necessarily in that world now because of the way that the debate has developed. But I also think that it's important for this issue to be discussed and managed in an alliance context between the U.S. and South Korea. And so that means actually that on the U.S. side, we need to be open to hearing what South Korea perceives its needs to be. But South Korea also needs to develop a broader understanding of the specifics around that potential decision point if they were to decide to make it.
The reason why South Korea wants to have nuclear weapons is because of the North Korean growing nuclear threat. And we had this threat. We tried to negotiate it out for the past 3 decades, but we still haven't succeeded. Is there any responsibility on the U.S. part to not being able to denuclearize North Korea, and we're in this stage where South Korea wants some nuclear weapons?
Well, I think the United States feels a lot of obligation to the security of South Korea and to U.S. interests. This is a mutual alliance. It's very strong. The fact that we have not succeeded in preventing North Korea from developing nuclear weapons is a reflection of our weakness in terms of our ability to impose our will on a determined sovereign country, in this case North Korea. So we have to recognize the limits of our power. But deterrence is, more than just nuclear weapons. As Scott Snyder has talked about, there's the assurance side of it. It's what are the promises that we're making, the pledges that we're making, what's the affirmative benefit of not having nuclear weapons? And I think there we can definitely do a better job to South Korea to say, we're in this together, and we're going to make sure that North Korea, despite whatever weapons this small power can build with its limited budget, we will surpass it in our deterrent capability together. And I think that's still the way to go. But yes, the extended deterrence discussions can start to explore the future possibility of nuclear proliferation. I don't think it's going to happen under the Biden administration, but it could happen in the future if this Northeast Asia continues to deteriorate in terms of proliferation.
And on that note, Mr. Snyder, this growing calls in South Korea for a nuclear weapon, is there more of a psychological aspect to that, do you think?
Well, I do think that a good part of what's going on between North and South Korea is related to psychology, because you have a failed state, essentially, whose only advantage is a nuclear capability, trying to project and signal that that capability would actually lead to the possibility of blackmail or dominance of North Korea over South Korea. And that's a psychological game that North Korea is playing. But South Korea also has to think about the psychology related to this, and basically to try to make sure that they're not being entrapped in North Korea's game. And I think that there is a conversation worth having between the U.S. and South Korea on how to give South Korea a greater sense of ownership as related to the capacity to defend itself.
Before we go, Dr. Cronin, you mentioned several times about the new national security strategy, and as you mentioned, there's only a couple sentences about North Korea. Is North Korea a back burner issue for the Biden administration?
Well, it's not a back burner issue for the administration, but it's a back burner issue in terms of what China and Russia are doing. And yes, the national security strategy is clearly focused on China. The strategy was delayed because of the war that Russia started against Ukraine. And there is that reference in the report to deterring tactical nuclear use by Russia. That's a phrase that essentially replicates what the Trump administration had in their nuclear posture review. And it's oriented toward North Korea, frankly, as well as Russia. So even though it's a very short reference, it's a pertinent one. It's relevant. It basically says, Kim, you can't use your nukes, period.
On that note, we'll wrap it up here. Dr. Cronin, Mr. Snyder, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that's all for us today. Have a great week, and we'll see you back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.